So just dance, dance, dance. So just dance, 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 go.
Welcome to Module 8, Lecture 22, the final lecture for the course Introduction to International Relations. This lecture is going to focus on Helen Milner's article on globalization, development, and international institutions. So, when we want to assess the role of international financial institutions, we have three questions we need to ask. The first is, what has been the impact of international financial institutions, or IFIs, on developing countries? Second, why have they had this impact? And third, what should their role be in the development process? So we're going to examine some claims about IFIs that were discussed in the article. One, they constrain the behavior of the most powerful states. This is something that liberals argue that IFIs are capable of, and that realists say is not the truth, and that international institutions in general just reflect the will of the most powerful states. IFIs provide information and reduce transaction costs, making it easier for countries to cooperate. They facilitate reciprocity. Remember, reciprocity is one of the three principles we learned about at the very beginning of class that helps to perhaps overcome the collective goods problem. And they may promote reform in domestic politics in that as countries realize that they want to gain more of a foothold in these institutions and have access to their resources, that the individuals in those countries may compel their leadership to make certain changes that would make them more amenable to receiving foreign finance and other forms of assistance. So now the question becomes, how can we evaluate claims about IFIs? The question is, would developing countries have been better off if these institutions had never even existed? So how can we go about solving that? We can use what are called counterfactuals. See, in political science, we have what's called the fundamental problem of causal inference. We can't rerun history in order to test whether some kind of condition would or would not have happened, or would not have had some kind of effect. So what we can do is use counterfactuals to provide us with some indirect information about any changes that might have occurred in a different scenario. So counterfactuals cannot be observed directly, and they rely on speculation, which are certainly shortcomings of using this kind of approach. But they have a couple of benefits too. It allows us to use what's called longitudinal comparison to look at before and after an event. So we can examine a country and look at before that country had any access to an international financial institution, then at the establishment point at which you have an IFI, and then after the fact. Is that developing country better off than it would have been prior to the establishment of that IFI? We can also use cross-sectional comparison, which is kind of like in pharmaceutical trials where you have a treatment group and a control group. Well, here we can look at, say, all developing countries in the world and see which ones actually receive money from an international financial institution, and are those better off in some meaningful metric like gross domestic product per capita or human development index? Are they somehow better off or even worse off after the intervention of an IFI in their government or economic system? So we can look at different countries and then evaluate which ones have had any kind of effect based on this kind of treatment versus control approach. But we should be aware of selection bias, which is an important thing to consider when we're looking at countries, because we don't want to cherry pick countries that might lead us to erroneous conclusions. Just as a more low-scale example of this, if we wanted to examine factors that influence high school graduation, if we only looked at people who graduated, we might be getting a biased sample. Maybe those people come from wealthier households, or they went to better schools, or they had tutors, or all different kinds of factors that might be relevant. So we want to make sure that we have a large population of cases to examine, and that if possible that they're kind of randomly selected, or that we have some meaningful selection criteria, like we're going to pick all of the countries in Africa, and then we're going to examine which of those have been better off based on whether they have received money from an international financial institution. But we shouldn't pick countries based on the outcome that we want to observe, like, say, an improvement, because it might not tell us about conditions that adhere in other countries that led to suboptimal conclusions or poor performance along economic, political, or social lines. So why should we even bother to study these things? IFIs focus on promoting economic development through financial assistance. But the progress among developing countries has been uneven. We've seen lots of variation, which is an interesting phenomenon for social scientists. So just look at this across region. This is a chart of the number of people living on less than $1.08 a day, which is considered sort of extreme poverty, in millions from 1981 through 2004, notwithstanding the projections for a moment. As you can see, there are stark differences between the different developing regions. If you look at the Middle East and North Africa, there has been a slight decline, certainly a very pronounced decline in East Asia and the Pacific, although if you were to look at the countries themselves and the impact that they have individually, you would see that probably most of that is a result of economic growth in China. Then look at countries like those in South Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. They have actually kind of stayed pretty steady, if not grown by a little bit. And then countries in sub-Saharan Africa have actually experienced an increase over that same time period. Now, it's another thing that's important to understand when looking at a chart like this is the absolute number of people. But it's possible that the number of people within the country increased, but the percentage of people within those countries who live on less than $1.08 a day has actually decreased as a percentage of the overall population. So even with this chart, we're really only getting one kind of slice of the truth, but it looks like at first blush that East Asia, the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Middle East and North Africa have made some improvements, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean have not done as well. So this tells us something, that certain regions have been more successful at reducing poverty than others. But we have to then look at the independent variables, the factors that affect the dependent variable, which in this case is the number of people living on less than $1.08 a day, to understand which factors were more important than others. Maybe it's the role of international financial institutions, maybe it's the process of democratization, maybe it's particularly good leadership. We don't know until we do the actual analysis. So the emphasis so far from IFIs has been placed mainly on the adoption of market-friendly policies in what has been known as the Washington Consensus, or the platform for achieving those goals that are stipulated as part of the Washington Consensus, which are known as structural adjustment programs. These were neoliberal economic policies designed to open up countries to international competition, reduce trade barriers, decrease the role of government in the economic sector, and the results are that some countries have been better off, but a lot of countries have not been assisted through structural adjustment programs. So, some of the problems associated with IFIs, it's possible that they have no impact at all, that developing countries are in fact impacted more by globalization or domestic factors, and so these institutions are really ancillary to the results that we're interested in. It's possible that there's capture by the powerful developed countries. The argument, this is sort of a realist argument, right, that these institutions serve only the rich and were never designed to address the needs of the poor, and the policy recommendations were drawn from the experiences of the developed world, but not the developing world, so they're ill-suited to actually address the problems in parts of the developing world. And it's also possible that there's capture by private producers and investors who have their own interests that have hijacked these institutions. So maybe they want to promote their own companies, their own investments, so that they can increase their own wealth, and that has had an impact on whether IFIs have been successful in certain countries. Another corollary to this is that IFIs may serve to open markets, but not necessarily to help poor countries. An example of this is cotton growing in Africa. The United States and other countries lobbied intensely for countries in the sub-Saharan Africa to open up their, or to decrease their trade barriers so that they could compete with the open market. But what they found was that cotton is being subsidized by other countries, making the cotton produced in sub-Saharan Africa not necessarily economically competitive. So it's kind of like talking out of both sides of your mouth, right? The international community says you need to lower your trade barriers, you need to compete on the open market, and then when you get to actually compete on the open market, you find that you're not competitive because other countries have instituted other kinds of non-tariff barriers that make it difficult for you to sell your products abroad. And then finally, it's also possible that there's some kind of organizational dynamics at play here, and that there's internal dysfunctions within these institutions and a failure of accountability. There are concerns within these institutions about career advancement and budget size, this is, we know some of this from organizational studies, right? That people who work for these kinds of agencies, whether we're talking about governments or international organizations, tend to want to do things that enhance their own prestige, further their career, improve the importance of their agency or office. So they're constantly looking for more ways to spend money and to be in the good graces of higher up leadership. And so this places the focus on sort of productivity in terms of making loans, but not necessarily monitoring the results to make sure that that money is being used for good purposes and having good outcomes.